Early Thursday morning, a Syrian missile landed in close proximity to Israel's top-secret nuclear facility at Dimona in the Negev desert. This comes in the wake of Israel attacking Iran's nuclear enrichment facility at Natanz. Was the timing of this just a coincidence, an errant missile as Israel claims, or rather the indication of something much deeper? Let's take a closer look at what unfolded. I'm Richard Medhurst, and you're watching the Communiqué. Early Thursday morning, reports began coming in through Israeli media of alarms and sirens going off near the Israeli nuclear reactor at Dimona in occupied Palestine. Within the hour, there were unconfirmed videos allegedly showing an explosion in the vicinity of Dimona from multiple angles. Although it wasn't clear exactly what this was, whether it was a target being struck or a missile being intercepted or simply blowing up mid-air. At the same time, there were also reports on social media from residents in Jerusalem and all over occupied Palestine of a large explosion being heard. Israeli media believe this to have been the sound of Israel's Patriot missile system being activated in response to a threat. Again, a lot of this was quite ambiguous at the time. It wasn't very clear what was happening. So let's go through the sequence of events and try to bring some clarity to this matter. So the very first thing that took place was that Israel attacked Syria. Israel proceeded to bomb targets in Dumair, which lies in the Damascus countryside, as well as targets in the occupied Golan Heights. A Syrian military source told the Syrian Arab news agency SANA that Israeli warplanes struck at 1:38 a.m. on Thursday, April 22nd. In response to that, Syria activated its anti-aircraft defense missile systems to counter the Israelis. As it did this, one of these surface-to-air missiles, or SAMs, that Syria launched apparently veered off target and went all the way into occupied Palestine, traveling some 200 kilometers and landing in close proximity to the nuclear reactor at Dimona, just some 30 kilometers away, completely unimpeded. Now, this facility is officially known as the Shimon Peres Negev Nuclear Research Center, and it's located in the Negev desert, some 13 kilometers southeast of the city of Dimona. Now, shortly afterwards, Israel again launched a second round of airstrikes on Syria, returning to bomb some of Syria's anti-aircraft batteries. The Syrian military source told SANA that in total 4 soldiers were wounded, and there were some losses of equipment sustained as well. Now, this incident comes at a particularly sensitive time, barely 2 weeks, not even 11 days after Israel secretly sabotaged Iran's own nuclear enrichment facility at Natanz. A spokesperson for the Israeli military insisted, however, that the Dimona nuclear facility was not the intended target of this Syrian missile and that it landed there by accident. Now, the Dimona facility is not home to just a nuclear reactor. It also houses something else. Joining me from Lebanon is Hadi Nasrallah, independent commentator and researcher. Thanks for taking the time, Hadi.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you for having me.
Can you tell us a bit more about this Dimona facility? The Israelis say that it's just a nuclear reactor. How true is that?
Basically, I think the Dimona facility, I'm going to start by saying that it always has been a pressure card in the hands of the axis of resistance, especially when it comes to resistance in Lebanon, Hezbollah. Said Nasrallah, in one of his speeches, he said that Lebanon holds a nuclear bomb. And then he later explained that statement, which was shocking for all of us at first. And then he said that our nuclear bomb basically in Lebanon is in Dimona. And he stated that Israel has a nuclear facility there. And if Israel continues its threat to Lebanon, the resistance is able to hit that facility, which can cause a lot of damage to Israel, or the occupied, basically, occupation entity. And later on, Israel moved some of the substances and some of its reactors and nuclear chemicals. They moved them to another area, another region, and they moved them underground. It was all documented. So Israel claimed that it's not actually a nuclear reactor facility. It's not actually for nuclear bombs. If it wasn't that, then why were they still threatened by the words of Mr. Nasrallah at first. And of course, Israel didn't sign any international deal when it comes to nuclear weapons. So there's no way to finding out if Israel is actually saying the truth about not having nuclear bombs.
Everyone is, fear-mongering about Iran having nuclear weapons, but we know for a fact that Israel has them. And as a matter of fact, some at this very facility in Dimona. What do you think of that double standard?
Well, basically, there were leaked emails before that Israel had 200 nuclear heads basically pointed towards Iran. And this didn't even shock anyone, and no one actually questioned that or talked about it. And then one false flag in Syria, you see all of these international organizations, all these countries condemning, and they want to get on the ground to investigate what few jihadists claimed. But something as serious as that, when it comes to Dimona, you have Iraq state, Iraq entity that literally caused a lot of chaos and devastation in the region, that there is a chance that such state can hold this amount of nuclear heads, and that yet this amount of silence, and no one's talking about it, no one's even investigating. So yeah, I personally believe that Israel, of course, they have nuclear. I mean, even Netanyahu, when he was once asked live on TV, and he didn't even deny. He said, "I'm not gonna say yes, I'm not gonna say no." Right. He didn't even say no.
There was an explosion actually a few days ago at an Israeli rocket factory, and there was also an Iranian newspaper recently talking about hitting the Dimona nuclear facility in response to Natanz. Is there any correlation between these incidents? Or do you think at the very least that it's keeping the Israelis on their toes?
Well, basically, of course, it's keeping the Israelis on their toes, but there's nothing confirmed yet if it's Iran. I mean, the Iranian media, they're always going to use anything to push their basically responses to Israel, or diplomat, or what do you call it, media response towards Israel. But even if Iran was responsible for this attack, if it's going to happen from the Syrian territories, and it's going to come with the authorization of the Syrian government. So for me, this act is both Syrian and Iranian, if it was actually Iranian attack, because in international law, Syria has every right to self-defend itself against Israeli continuous aggressions. The past 3 years alone, Israel bombed Damascus more than 500 times, and Israel continues to support Al-Qaeda on the borders of the occupied Golan. And in 2017, they helped Al-Qaeda enter the Golan, Israeli-occupied Golan, to attack a Syrian village on the other side where the Syrian army was trying to control that region. And of course, Israel is also responsible for looting a lot of Jewish artifacts from the Jobar synagogue near Ghouta area. And a lot of investigations showed that those took those artifacts and they sent them to New York City via Qatar. And Israel had them all right now in Tel Aviv. So all that is happening, and Syria, whatever Syria does, they have the right to self-defense, just like they did in 2018 when they shot down an Israeli F-16.
I haven't seen anyone in the media even begin to question what Israel was doing in Syria in the first place. Why is that?
Basically, the media is trying to shy away the Washington camp. Whoever is on Washington's camp in Syria, they're trying just to hide whatever they're doing because they don't want to embarrass their foreign policy, or they want to embarrass the regime change agenda in Syria. So you're talking about the same media that called the bombing of 200 children in Aleppo in 2017, they called it a hiccup just because those children come from loyalist villages. They're not going to show the truth of what's happening. And definitely, even though Israel is not hiding the fact they're supporting Al-Qaeda, former Mossad head of Mossad told Al Jazeera that, yes, we're helping Al-Qaeda, but we're not actually going to help Hezbollah if the same scenario happened. He didn't lie. He just said what's happening, and yet the media's choosing to cover for them and choosing to hide the fact that Israel is not defending itself in Syria. They're helping a global terrorist organization in Syria against the Syrian people, against this legitimate Syrian government. So when Syria retaliates, then because the media keep hiding the Israeli action in Syria, the people won't know that Syria has every right to actually self-defend itself against Israel. So I think that's what they're doing, because they know one day Syria is going to retaliate, and then they don't want people to have enough content to actually justify for Syria.
Is it going to change their behavior when they attack Syria? Because, as you just mentioned, as we know, they do this almost every week. So do you think that this kind of was a wake-up call?
I was asked that question when Syria downed an F-16, an Israeli F-16, and I said, I'm going to say the same thing right now. No, it's not going to affect it, because Israel is never going to stop aggressing Syria as long as it sees Syria winning. Let's put it that way. As long as Syria is winning, Israel is going to keep getting involved, giving logistic support for any terrorist organization that's happening. And I believe, okay, the attacks might just slow down those few days, but they're not going to stop. They're going to come back and they're going to keep attacking until there's enough retaliation against the state. And for me, things will escalate more. Israel's trying to drag the region into a war. They're trying to drag the U.S. administration into war. They're trying to provoke any side they can. And the Axis of Resistance, they stated more than one time that they won't be dragged into an Israeli provocation.
So let me ask you then, what do you think it's going to take for Israel to stop?
A full-on Syrian victory against the global terrorist organizations. That's as long as there are terrorists controlling Syria, Israel won't stop helping the last one against what Israel believes is a threat to its existence.
Hadi Nasrallah, thank you so much for your brilliant analysis and insight. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Richard. It was nice seeing you.
We'll be right back after this short break. Now, the S-200 surface-to-air missile, also known as the SA-5, is an anti-aircraft missile developed by Russia in the 1960s. It has a maximum range of up to 300 kilometers and carries with it a 200-kilogram warhead. Indeed, what has everyone quite perplexed is how this S-200 exactly made the entire journey from Syria to Dimona, seemingly without being shot down by Israel, which again boasts one of the most capable air and missile defense systems, which is subsidized by the United States. Joining me is veteran war correspondent and journalist Elijah Manier. Thanks for coming on the program. Elijah, it's great to have you on.
Thank you for having me.
So Elijah, this incident that we just saw unfold at Dimona, it comes, again, less than 2 weeks after Israel sabotaged the Natanz nuclear enrichment facility in Iran. I think the question that is burning on everyone's minds at the moment is, are these two incidents related in any capacity? Is this perhaps retaliation for what just took place? What are your thoughts on that?
There are 2 points here to mention. The first one is the most important one, is that the Israeli interception system has failed, and it is dramatically failed, and that is the most important. If a missile can cross the whole territory and reach to Dimona, 200 kilometers, 170 kilometers in depth, that is a real scandal and a revelation to how unprepared the Israeli interception missiles are, notwithstanding the whole noise that the Israelis are making about the effectiveness of the interception missiles, where they have dramatically failed. The second one, it is something that is good for the audience to know, that we have seen this happening before. In Yemen, the Houthis have used this kind of missiles and have removed a small piece in the missile that is called the self-destruction. So the surface-to-air missiles are made in a way that they explode in the air if they do not reach a target, so they fall in pieces and do not hurt civilians when they fall. And the Houthi, they have used this kind of missiles by removing this self-destruction and allowing the missile to take the maximum range and then fall like any other rocket. However, we have seen in the photos shown by the Israelis that this missile that fell close to Dimona has a brain. And when I say has a brain, it means it has an electronic circuit. And by having this kind of brain, it means it can intercept a jet, it can intercept a target, it can be directed toward a specific target. Now, there's another point, and that's my last point as an answer to your question, is it is very convenient for President Bashar al-Assad to say nothing about it. So it is an errant missile, if the Israeli want to think like that. It can be some technical failure, and it went on its normal course, but accidentally it has reached close to Dimona, the nuclear facility that is clandestine to the world, where inspectors cannot go there and tell us what the Israelis are doing.
Yeah, so the Yemeni version that you just mentioned, it immediately made me think of the V1 doodle bug that the Germans developed during World War II, which would explode on impact. So, as you mentioned, we saw pictures of the Israelis picking up pieces of this S-200. If you don't mind getting a bit more technical, Israel boasts that it has this very comprehensive air defense system. They have the Iron Dome, David Sling, Arrow 123. How does this supposedly antiquated S-200 from the Cold War get so deep inside of enemy territory? Do you get a sense that the Israelis are trying to downplay the incident and they know more than they're letting on?
Well, that's a very good question. The Israeli media is not going easy on Netanyahu and on the Israeli defense systems. They're saying that Netanyahu was sleeping during his shift. He did not wake up to protect the country. That all the interception system we have is a failure. And in a month's time, Israelis have a maneuver on how to confront several front in different countries, and all firing missiles at the same time. I think there is an overestimation of the Israeli defensive system, because it is very normal for the axis of the resistance to flood whatever capable the Israeli interception system is, including the US interception system, that both showed a clear failure in intercepting the Houthi Yemeni missiles launched against Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia, there are not only the US and the Israeli, but also the British interception system, and all three systems failed to intercept the Houthi missiles fired from Yemen and the Houthi drones. So the Israeli, when they want to overestimate their capability, they go to 90%, which is extremely highly estimated and is not even close to the reality. And if we say 50-50, it means that Israel is in deep trouble in case of war. This is why Israel is not going to war, not against Syria, not against Lebanon, not against Iraq, and is extremely afraid that today the other side, on the other side of the border, is much more better equipped than it used to be in 2006. And today Israel cannot just think of doing a promenade over the Lebanese airspace or the Syrian airspace and get away with it.
Right, because, the Israelis, they've done thousands of airstrikes in the last decade alone on Syria. And 2 weeks ago, we saw that Syria responded to an Israeli aggression over Lebanese airspace. Now we see this over Palestinian airspace. Do you think this is going to make future raids by the Israelis more difficult? Do you feel that last night a message has been sent?
I think the last night is a message from both governments. It is from the government in Damascus and the government in Tehran. And I think the government in Damascus is not willing to go to war with Israel. The Russians want to avoid this escalation, because still the war in Syria is not over. We still have Idlib, and we still have the pro-US forces in the northeast Syria. And we still have the borders between Iraq and Syria on the Tanaf occupied by the US occupation forces. This is why the Russians are saying to the Syrian government, we can give you all the interception missiles that you want. We try to put pressure on the Israelis. We are informed, and the Russians are informing the Syrian and the Iranians before any attack takes place. However, this is not sufficient. The Syria, because of the economic sanction on the country, EU, US, because of the Caesar Act that Iran is violating, quite often by sending, so far, only last month they've sent 3 million barrels of oil. But because of all that, I don't think President Assad is willing to go to war with Israel right at the moment. However, this message from Iran is very helpful to put back Netanyahu in its place and tell him that if we want to retaliate, when we want to retaliate, we're going to use our means, including our allies' precision weapons, because Iran has delivered to Syria hundreds of precision weapons that can make Israel tremble. The decision lies in the hand of the President Assad, and it's up to him to decide when to impose deterrence on the Israelis. But the Israelis are waiting for that day, and they know it's going to come.
Elijah Manier, thank you so much for your proficient and technical insight. It's a pleasure having you on.
Thank you.
Following the incident, Syria rebuked the Israeli attack and called on the United Nations Security Council to condemn Israel for violating the Agreement on Disengagement of 1974 and to uphold the mandates of UN Security Council resolutions 242, 338, 350, and 497, which call on Israel to withdraw from the Syrian Golan Heights, which it invaded in 1967. Israel has been illegally occupying the Golan Heights since 1967 and even proceeded to annex them. Israel uses the Syrian Golan Heights, which are not only rich in oil and water and other resources, but also an important strategic and military point. It uses them to stage air raids and attacks on a regular basis in and around the Golan Heights in Syria. Israel bombs Syria on a regular basis, and it's not an exaggeration. This is actually happening almost every single week. Israel doesn't typically comment on these raids, but has previously admitted to them and admitted to bombing Syria hundreds of times. And that was back in 2018. We're in 2021. This figure is now in the thousands. Israel knows that Syria is going through a war. There are a dozen plus countries and many more factions ripping the country apart. So Israel takes advantage of that to apply pressure from the south. Israel's former chief of Mossad has even admitted in an interview with Mahdi Hassan on Al Jazeera that Israel gave aid and assistance to al-Qaeda fighters just for the sake of seeing the Syrian government fall. So this should give you some indication, some idea as to how determined the Israelis are to attack Syria. Israel bombed Syria under the pretext of targeting so-called Iranian militias or Hezbollah. But number one, this is unverified. Again, Israel says this, but no one corroborates it. There's no evidence of that. Number two, and more importantly, this is still a violation of international law and the United Nations Charter to attack a sovereign country. Just because Israel says it's doing X, Y, Z doesn't make that legal. Right? This is not self-defense, nor is it permitted or mandated by the United Nations Security Council. Even if this were true, that there are Iranian or other troops inside of Syria, that's not Israel's business, that's Syria's business. Syria is a sovereign, independent country. It has the right to have alliances with whomever it wishes. The United States has over 800 bases in other countries. Has the mainstream media ever checked to see if these claims by Israel are true? Has it ever verified them? Has the media ever even said that this is a violation of international law and criticized Israel for that? The media only seems to repeat these claims by Israel, which is propaganda, and they report it as fact with no scrutiny whatsoever. Again, that's not reporting, that's propaganda. In addition to these bombings by Israel, which happen almost every week, Israel continues to occupy the Syrian Golan Heights illegally and has outright said it will never relinquish them. Benny Gantz has said Israel will never withdraw, even though this is a violation of multiple UN Security Council resolutions which were unanimously passed by everyone at the time, including the United States. It seems that Israel, unfortunately, has no respect for Iran's sovereignty, for Syria's sovereignty, and definitely not for Palestinian sovereignty. Israel does not respect the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which it has not signed, nor the Chemical Weapons Convention. Israel violates the United Nations Charter practically every single week, if not every day. Perhaps if the international community will not put its foot down and restrain Israel from conducting illegal strikes and raids and committing acts of war almost every other day against Syria, then hopefully what just took place will deter the Israelis and make them think twice before they launch unprovoked attacks on Syria and violate its independence and sovereignty. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Richard Medhurst, and this is The Communiqué.